The Last of Us is not your typical zombie game experience, and the soundtrack, composed and produced by Argentinian musician Gustavo Santaolalla, reflects this. But before we get into the music, let's figure out just what sort of game is The Last of Us. Zombies have been around for centuries, though the current trend of them staggering around, or worse, sprinting around, hungering for human flesh, came about specifically from the film Night of the Living Dead in 1968. Since then, they have maintained a pretty consistent popularity in our culture and media. Resident Evil is often credited for kicking off the zombie survival horror genre in video games in 1996. Before that, games were pretty lackluster and limited by the technology of the time. A decade or so after Resident Evil, the zombie genre was really taking off, with zombie mode even being added to games like Call of Duty and Red Dead Redemption. But in general, the theme across all these games was pretty similar. Kill zombies before they kill you. That was the whole point of those types of games. Sure, there may be a story underneath the carnage, but narratively speaking, if you take the story away from a game like Left 4 Dead, the game doesn't really change that much. Also, listen to some of the musical tracks from these games. These zombie games have music that is either intended to energize the player for a fight with heavy rock beats, punk or metal style vocals, and distorted instruments, or create an atmosphere of horror and unease. Now compare those with the main theme from The Last of Us. It hits different, right? It doesn't have the same raw energy or upsetting sonorities as other games in the zombie genre, but it works perfectly for the game. Why? In a 2011 interview with Eurogamer, Naughty Dog said that The Last of Us was, in fact, not a zombie game, but a story-driven experience. The general response from critics was, "Sure, but there are clearly zombies that clearly chase you and try to eat you, and you have to clearly shoot them in the face, so zombie game, right?" And yes, you could argue both ways, but what Naughty Dog was saying in that statement is that the zombie theme is not so much the point of the game, as with the other games, but rather the backdrop against which the game is set. The true point of the game is the relationship that grows and changes between the primary protagonists, Joel and Ellie. One of the biggest differences between The Last of Us and other zombie games of the time was the setting. Typically, there is either no explanation given, like with zombie Nazis in Call of Duty, or the game is set in the direct aftermath of the initial infection, which has spread like wildfire. The Last of Us actually opens in the aftermath of the initial infection, and the opening sequence has Joel racing to escape from town with his daughter and brother. Any other zombie game would have handed you a shotgun and picked up right there. The Last of You takes you through that sequence, and then jump cuts to 20 years later. Zombies, the infected, are not a scary new threat at this point, they're just a way of life. And for most people, they aren't even the greatest threat, compared to the general lack of food and resources and the total militarization of daily life. So now the stage is set. With this in mind, let's look at how Santaolalla has crafted the main theme of the game. Santaolalla does not read or write music, preferring instead to simply record as he plays and see what happens. His favorite instrument is the ronroco, a variety of the Andean charango pitched lower. As you can see, there is a consistent stream of plucked eighth notes propelling the rhythm, but the melody is actually this top line of notes starting here, so let's focus on those. We get a pretty standard 8-bar phrase, forming a parallel period, sometimes known as an antecedent consequent phrase. This means that the musical material is similar between these two 4-bar phrases, but the first ends on a half cadence, and the second ends on a stronger authentic cadence. Looking closer, we can see the simplicity of the melodic design. The primary note is clearly this G. The first subphrase outlines a double neighbor, moving up to A, down to F, then landing back on G, while the second subphrase climbs to B. The third subphrase exactly imitates the first, then the final subphrase mirrors the second, but descending to tonic E. If we were to assign conventional harmonies to this, we wouldn't need a lot. We could start with a tonic chord, then move to some form of dominant, then return to tonic. At the end of the first phrase, we could end on a dominant, setting up the half cadence we expect in a parallel period. These cadences are, of course, theoretical, because in reality we never stop hearing the tonic E minor chord underneath all of this. This minimalist approach to composition will be pertinent to our conversation in a little bit. There is, however, one note that disrupts all attempts at conventional harmonization, this B flat. In E minor, this is a lowered scale degree 5, or Se in solfege. Chromatically altering scale degree 5 is risky business, since it is typically the most stable tone of the scale after the tonic pitch itself. Messing with it has the potential to mess with our entire sense of tonality. It doesn't though, because of this minimalist use of the tonic chord I mentioned earlier. E minor is so embedded in our ear by this point that nothing can shake it, which is why this B flat sticks out as a colorful note without us losing where we are in the key. The next two phrases have more harmonic movement, relatively speaking. Instead of just a tonic E minor chord, we get the bass moving up to A here. This supports a descending chromatic stepwise melody outlining the tonic 1, a major 4, a minor 4, then back to 1. Whenever we get a chord that shifts from major to minor, it's really effective because it packs a lot of bang for the composer's buck, so to speak. We hear major and minor chords differently, typically distinguished as happy versus sad, although that's an oversimplification. Lowering this third by a half step means that the voice leading is really smooth. Only one note changes by 1 half step, but the emotional impact is significantly more. Especially here, when it's the first major chord we've heard yet, and it gets taken away from us so quickly. After the second phrase, we move into the final cadence. The bass shifts back up to A, implying a plagal 4-1 motion, but we're not quite there yet. An inner voice echoes the previous phrase, moving chromatically from D down to B, while the melody follows, outlining a longer descent from scale degree 5 down to tonic. This chromatic motion underneath means that the chords we get in this otherwise straightforward plagal cadence are an A with a 4-3 suspension, resolving to a major 4, then moving into a minor 4-7, then hanging around a 2 diminished 6 before returning to tonic. We've seen this sort of plagal substitution before if you watch my video analyzing Aerith's theme from Final Fantasy VII. The use of a 2 chord replacing a 4 chord in a plagal cadence weakens the already weaker cadence further, and also adds a little bit of despair to it, especially when the 2 is diminished like it is here. Then we get this B section that totally shifts the mood. We've been living in E minor land with various diminished sonorities. Then suddenly we get this very major section. Over the course of 8 bars, we move from C major to G major, with some added ninths in for an extra feel-good bump. Note how this 4-1 motion mirrors the cadence we just heard, but in major this time. The next phrase rocks between B minor and E minor, recalling the first section. The second half of the B section moves back through C major to G major, with a stepwise descent down from B over these chords. So where did that come from? Well, musically speaking, E minor and G major are relative keys of each other, so it wasn't a long trip to get there. But thematically speaking, how does such a cheerful bridge fit in a game about fighting for survival? Well, remember that for The Last of Us, zombies are simply the backdrop against which we see Joel and Ellie develop their relationship through mutual struggle. That is what this music represents, an overall sense of struggle, with moments of relief and compassion and even happiness along the journey. The point is not to be mired in wave after wave of flesh-starved monsters, but to get to know the characters, their flaws, their motivations, and ultimately, what makes them work together so well as a team. The music gives us a sense of that story. The opening melody over an incessant E minor harmony is like the day-to-day struggle to survive in a world where there doesn't look to be any light at the end of the tunnel, made even more desperate by that B flat that doesn't fit in the key. The next section gives us a hint of major along with a glimpse of hope, but ultimately settles back into the original theme of unending struggle. Then the B section, which is undeniably more uplifting, lets us remember those moments of the game where things are actually going alright. Times when Joel and Ellie were teasing each other, or getting along really well, or even having a really special moment. But that's not the direction the game goes, really, and the last part of the track brings it back to the ongoing struggle. The final line actually cadences using a Phrygian 2 chord, an F major chord leading back to the tonic E minor. This chord is neither in the key, nor the quality that it should be, which makes it stick out sort of as a big question mark. The music gives us that sense of struggle and hints at moments of relief, but ultimately, what will the end of Joel and Ellie's story be? Thank you for watching this video about the main theme of The Last of Us, and I hope you gleaned some information about either the music theory of the music or the narrative power of the soundtrack. If you enjoyed it, I hope you'll like this video and subscribe for more content. Tune in next time when we'll finally look at some happy, upbeat music by analyzing phrase structure and form in Kirby themes. See you next time.